The film begins by introducing us to a scientist and his daughter, Wei. Both of them have a strange mark on their faces, which diminishes their appearance. The scientist has set up a lab in his home, where he has been conducting experiments for a long time. Meanwhile, Wei is drawing a picture of a flower known as the crop flower. Her father explains to her that this flower possesses incredible healing powers and blooms only once in a while deep within the jungle. He reveals that he has used this flower in his experiments multiple times. After years of research, the scientist finally succeeds in creating a serum capable of concealing the mark on his face. The serum he developed has the unique ability to merge the tissues of two different entities. He cuts a piece of skin, applies a chemical to it, and attaches it to his face. As soon as the skin is applied, it begins to grow rapidly. The tissues regenerate and the skin slowly spreads, eventually covering his mouth and forming wounds. Horrified by what is happening, the scientist panics. His intention was only to remove the mark on his face, but the skin continues to grow uncontrollably, covering his entire mouth. In a desperate attempt to stop it, he cuts the skin around his lips, but it reattaches itself and continues to spread, eventually covering his eyes and nose. Despite repeatedly cutting the skin, it keeps regenerating, leaving him terrified. In a moment of sheer panic, the scientist stabs his father with a knife, killing him. Overwhelmed with guilt and grief, he breaks down, realizing he has lost the only person who mattered to him. Time passes, and Wei grows up to be an exceptional student, much like her father. Her academic excellence earns her a scholarship to a prestigious university in the United States. She leaves her hometown and moves to the U.S., where she stays with her aunt and her cousin Angie. Angie is less than thrilled about Wei's arrival, as she now has to share her room. Wei sets up a small shrine in her room, placing a picture of her father there. It becomes clear that she idolizes her father, almost worshipping him. Among her belongings, we see notes and items related to her father's experiments, indicating that she is continuing his research, the same research that led to his tragic death. The next day marks Wei's first day at the university. On her way there, she encounters a homeless man with a disfigured face. Wei stares at him for a few moments before he kindly helps her find her way to the university. Grateful, Wei continues on her journey. In class, the professor proudly introduces Wei to her peers, highlighting her remarkable achievement of scoring 100% on the entrance exam, a feat not accomplished in years. After class, Wei stays behind to gather materials for her experiments. The professor notices her and questions her actions. Wei explains that she needs the materials to continue her father's research. The professor informs her that taking lab materials is not allowed, but offers her a solution. If she becomes his lab assistant, she can access the resources she needs. Wei reveals that her father was a brilliant scientist, and she is determined to carry on his work. She hands the professor her father's research diary, which leaves him astonished. Intrigued, the professor looks into Wei's father's background and discovers that he was indeed a genius scientist whose work was hindered by a lack of funding. Meanwhile, at home, Angie's friends visit and begin snooping through Wei's belongings. They stumble upon strange tools, blood-filled containers, and disturbing images related to her experiments. Terrified by what they find, they quickly leave. The next day, Wei notices Angie sitting with her friends and feels a longing to connect with them. She approaches them and offers to take them out for lunch. Despite their reluctance, due to the mark on Wei's face, they agree. However, at the restaurant, Wei's unusual eating habits make them uncomfortable, and they abandon her, leaving her alone. Wei packs the leftover food and, on her way home, gives it to the homeless man she had met earlier. She strikes up a conversation with him, confiding that the mark on her face makes her feel ugly. The homeless man reassures her, saying, "You are beautiful just the way you are." His words comfort Wei, lifting her spirits. As she continues her journey home, Wei runs into her professor, who offers her a ride. The professor had written a proposal for Wei, offering to help her complete her father's research. However, he needed Wei's permission to proceed, as it was her father's work. Wei happily agreed, as the professor was the first person to genuinely support her in this endeavor. Starting the next day, they began working on the experiment together. Despite their hard work over many days, the experiment failed to yield the desired results. All their efforts seemed to be going to waste, and the professor grew increasingly frustrated. Eventually, he decided to abandon the experiment altogether. Wei was disheartened by this decision. Around this time, Angie's friend Alice arrived at the lab to apply for the position of lab assistant. The professor accepted her request, and she began working alongside Wei. On their way home, Alice apologized to Wei for her past behavior, and the two became friends. During their conversation, Wei noticed a poster in Alice's possession featuring the same flower her father had used in his experiments. This flower, the crop flower, was now part of an exhibition. Seeing the poster, Wei was struck by a mix of emotions. She recalled her father's words about the flower's importance to their research. Realizing that the flower was essential for the experiment, Wei decided to steal it. That night, she sneaked into the nearby farmhouse where the exhibition was being held and took the flower. Wei brought the stolen flower to the lab and immediately began her experiment. Unbeknownst to her, the professor and Alice were secretly observing her from a hidden spot. Wei extracted the flower's essence and added it to her serum. She then cut a piece of skin from her foot, divided it into two, and applied the serum. To her amazement, the serum successfully fused the two pieces of skin back together. Encouraged by this success, Wei applied the serum to the area where she had removed the skin. The skin began to regenerate, turning white before reforming completely. The professor, watching through the window, was astonished by what he saw. He quickly sent Alice away and confronted Wei, demanding an explanation. Wei excitedly explained how the flower's serum had finally made their experiment work. As Wei showed the professor the regenerated skin on her foot, Alice grew jealous and suspicious. She secretly took pictures of Wei's strange experiment and later scolded her, forcing her to leave the lab. In her haste, Wei accidentally left her father's notebook behind, which delighted the professor. Meanwhile, Alice sent the pictures she had taken to Wei's cousin Angie. Angie was furious when she saw the photos. In a fit of rage, she destroyed several items in the room. When Wei returned and saw the mess, she was deeply saddened. Suddenly, Angie attacked her from behind, attempting to kill her. Wei struggled to defend herself and, in the chaos, accidentally stabbed Angie in the neck with a pen. Angie died instantly. Terrified, Wei dragged Angie's body to the bathroom. Unsure of what to do next, she began to think of a way to cover up the incident. In a desperate and twisted move, Wei decided to use her serum. She removed the skin from Angie's mouth and applied her serum to it, then attached it to her own face. The tissues of Wei's face and Angie's skin fused together, making Wei look exactly like Angie. When Angie's mother returned home, she mistook Wei for her daughter and embraced her warmly. Wei, realizing the benefits of this deception, decided to continue living as Angie. The next morning, she dressed in Angie's clothes and adopted her mannerisms, fully immersing herself in Angie's life. At the university, Wei, now disguised as Angie, met Angie's boyfriend. For the first time, a boy showed interest in her, and Wei felt a sense of happiness she had never experienced before. She began to enjoy Angie's life, relishing the attention from Angie's friends, boyfriend, and mother. However, during a date with Angie's boyfriend, the skin on Wei's face began to peel off, revealing her true identity. Horrified, the boyfriend stumbled backward in fear and accidentally fell down a slope, resulting in his death. Panicked, Wei rushed home and began searching for her father's notebook, hoping it contained the secret to permanently attaching the skin and preventing it from peeling off. Wei couldn't find her father's notebook because it was still with the professor. However, she still had a small amount of the serum left. She injected it into her skin once again, restoring Angie's face. Meanwhile, the professor was shown searching for the flower that had made the experiment successful. While searching for the flower, The professor received a call from the translator, who was converting the notebook into English. The translator warned him that the experiment was extremely dangerous and could have severe consequences. Despite the translator's clear advice to stop the experiment immediately, the professor ignored him and continued his pursuit. Wei returned to the university to retrieve her father's notebook, but couldn't find it in the lab. Unbeknownst to her, the professor had given it to the translator. Frustrated, Wei called the professor, who coldly informed her that he had the notebook and intended to publish the experiment under his own name. Wei was furious but felt powerless to stop him. She left the university quietly, seething with anger. As she stepped outside, Wei saw Eve, another student who she discovered was also involved with the professor. Consumed by rage, Wei decided to take her anger out on Eve. Disguised as Angie, she invited Eve to her house. When Eve arrived, Wei attacked her in a fit of rage. Eve, terrified, tried to escape and ran into the garden, but Wei caught her there. Using a drill machine, Wei killed Eve. After killing Eve, Wei removed her skin and applied it to her own face, transforming herself to look exactly like Eve. She styled her hair and dressed like Eve, even mimicking her mannerisms to ensure no one would recognize her. During this gruesome process, a neighbor's dog began barking incessantly, prompting the neighbors to call the police. When the police arrived, they saw Eve in a towel and left without further investigation. The next morning, Wei, now disguised as Eve, went to the university. She felt a sense of satisfaction as Eve was a popular student, and everyone greeted her warmly. Later, she went to the professor's house, still disguised as Eve, hoping to retrieve her father's notebook. The professor, unaware of her true identity, allowed her inside. Wei searched the entire house but couldn't find the notebook. Meanwhile, Wei had hidden the bodies of Angie and Eve in the pool. She began going through their phones and discovered a picture of herself with the professor. Alice had been using this picture to defame Wei. Wei decided to use the picture against the professor. She emailed it to the authorities, exposing the professor for exploiting students for his own gain. The authorities acted swiftly, arresting the professor. However, due to his influence, he was released on bail the next day. Back at home, the professor resumed the experiment, following the steps meticulously. To his surprise, he successfully created the serum, which fused two pieces of skin together. Despite his success, the professor felt no joy. At the same time, Wei, still disguised as Eve, arrived at his house. The professor, excited to see Eve, invited her in and went to prepare some food. While the professor was occupied, Wei searched for her father's notebook. She found it in a cabinet, along with the serum the professor had just created. Without hesitation, she took the serum and fled. When the professor returned and checked the cabinet, he realized the serum was missing and grew suspicious. That night, Wei returned to her home, now in her real face. Alice visited her, distraught over the mysterious disappearance of her two friends. Wei, pretending to be sympathetic, hugged Alice and offered her support. Now, Alice needed a drink of water. When she opened the fridge, she was horrified to find the frozen body parts of her two friends inside. Terrified, she began to scream. Before anyone could hear her or she could alert someone, Wei quickly covered Alice's face with a clay trap, suffocating and ultimately killing her. Wei didn't bother to hide this murder. Just then, the doorbell rang. The professor stood outside. Noticing the door was unlocked, he entered the house. Inside, he found Wei sitting in a strange manner. When she saw the professor, she began to laugh eerily. The professor, unsettled by her behavior, felt a sense of unease. Wei, still disguised as Eve, congratulated the professor on the success of the experiment. The professor, initially pleased, was soon reminded that the experiment was not his but her father's. Ignoring her angry remarks, the professor walked toward the fridge to retrieve his serum. However, upon opening the fridge, he was shocked to discover the frozen bodies inside. He was left breathless, struggling to process the gruesome sight. Wei, however, remained calm and cunning. She swiftly injected the professor with a sedative, rendering him unconscious. When the professor regained consciousness, he found that Wei had removed the skin from his entire body. He screamed in horror as Wei began applying the serum to his exposed flesh. She then placed a piece of skin on his body, which began to grow uncontrollably, just as it had with her father earlier in the film. Wei had inserted a straw into the professor's mouth, but the skin continued to spread, covering his body and suffocating him. Within moments, the professor was dead. His screams had been heard by a neighbor, who promptly called the police. Realizing the police were on their way, Wei panicked and fled the house. The police spotted her running and gave chase. In her desperation, Wei sought help from the homeless man she had befriended earlier. Remembering her kindness, the homeless man hid her in his bed, shielding her from the police. However, as Wei sat there, the serum she had been carrying suddenly broke. The spilled serum caused the tissues of Wei and the homeless man to begin merging together. Their bodies fused, transforming them into a grotesque monster. Wei, now trapped in this monstrous form, could do nothing but sit in despair. At that moment, Wei Zan arrived, searching for her missing daughter Angie. Unable to reveal the truth about Angie's fate, Wei, now a monster, could only watch in silence. The story ends on this haunting note, leaving the fate of Wei and the homeless man unresolved.